Hey guys, what's up? So we had a question in one of our Facebook groups the other day, and the guy, he asked the question like, what makes someone a noob? What makes someone an intermediate? And what makes someone advanced in game? Like, what are the definitions for each skill level? And how do you move from each skill level to the other? Like, for example, how do you go from noob to intermediate? Like, what are the most common sticking points for someone in the noob category? What are the most common sticking points for someone in the intermediate category? And how do you progress from being an intermediate to being advanced? So that's basically what I'm gonna cover in this video today. Like I've heard this question actually a lot of times, and I used to ask myself this question, like what makes someone like really good at game? What makes someone like average? And like why do some people just like suck? But like I could never find any good definitions of this. So I sat down and I wrote down like what my personal definitions are and like what are like some of the traits that I look for like in students, like somewhat like determine what their current skill level is so that I'm able to help them in the best way. So without further ado, let's just get straight into it. All right, so let's start off with talking about what really like defines the level of like a beginner or like a noob, right? So the number one thing that really stands out to me is that the more beginner you are, the more fluff is going to be in the interactions. Like if you take someone who's like really new to game, like a lot of the things they're saying is said without a purpose or like an intention. Like they're basically just making small talk and they're not like really thinking about moving the interaction forward, and they're not being proactive about it. Which sort of ties into like the second point here, which is they don't really have like a plan or like a strategy. But what I mean more with like no plan or like no strategy is like more on like a macro level. They don't really have like a clear picture in their head of like, okay, this is where I am right now. I need to do this, this, and this to get to this specific stage. Like how they're gonna move along from like, if you imagine like the interactions, like a big timeline, you have open and close. They don't really have like a clear idea of how to move along this timeline. And that's obviously like a big problem. So one of the things that I really want to get into beginners like really quick, really early on, is like I want to teach them a structure. Like I want them to know and be able to like identify, okay, I'm here right now, here is where I need to go, and this is what I do to get from A to B, basically. This is something that like when I do like one-on-one coaching, like when we run boot camps or whatever, this is something that I really put a lot of emphasis on, because I believe that if they don't have a structure, like how the fuck are they ever going to be consistent, like especially when they're on their own? So it's really important to learn that. Something else is that they don't really know how to apply some of the fundamentals of verbal game. Like, so for example, they don't know how to DHV, they don't know how to get her to qualify, they don't know how to sexualize, they don't know how to close, like they don't know what to say basically. But this is something that needs to be sort of like addressed after they have like a structure down, because otherwise it's going to be a little bit all over the place. But this is typically what I like to get them to focus on after that. Something else is that they typically have like a general lack of understanding between social dynamics. So for example, if you tell a beginner to like, okay, look at this group right in front of you, like what do you see going on? A lot of times they won't be able to really answer like what's going on between the people in front of them. And this is something that's really important if you want to be able to do group sets, for example, like because not every group set is going to be approached the same way. Like you need to calibrate the dynamic between the people in front of you. So that's something that's super important. But not only that, like even when it's like one-on-one, because if you're not aware of these things, you're going to end up like be in really bad positions. Like you're going to be chasing, it's just not going to be good. Something else is that they're typically not that great at interpreting or reading frames. Like they don't understand the concept of frames, which obviously is like really understandable because most people don't. It's not something that is really like taught anywhere. But like frame control is, frames, it's basically like what is said between the lines, like what is the subtext of what is being communicated right now. And this is something that I've covered in like previous videos, like in text game videos, but as I say about pretty much every single topic, I'm gonna make a separate video on that in the future, because I feel like this is really like one of the absolutely most important things. If you want to get really good at this, you need to understand frames. There is no fucking way that you're gonna be good at this without understanding frames. Something else is that they're not able to accurately interpret compliance levels. So for example, they can't really differentiate between getting positive compliance, neutral compliance, or negative compliance. If you want like an analogy for this, you have like the traffic light analogy, like am I getting like a red light? Is it like a yellow light, like neutral, or is it like a red light? And you know, this is obviously something that's really fucking important to learn, because if you do what you would do for positive compliance when you're getting negative compliance, that's 100% going to like result in the end of the interaction. And something else that's obviously like very like characteristic for like a beginner or like a noob is like there's like little to no actual like results, if you know what I mean. Like progress is being made, hopefully, but in terms of like tangible results, there might not be a lot of them. And the next point is sort of like tied into like the first thing that I said, that like most of the interactions were stuff. So there's like a very poor decision making on both a macro level and a micro level. So like most of the things that like a beginner would say, they're like completely random. And you know, they won't always like make sense to the context. Like basically it's a bit uncalibrated. Most of the decisions that you make on where to take the interactions are also like completely random. And obviously this ties into the previous points about not having like a plan or like a strategy. And generally all of this will also be accompanied by having like really weak subcoms. So for example, like something that could be like really characteristics with the weak subcoms could be like there's like a lack of assertiveness. There's like a lack of dominance in their body language. Like, you know, they might have like really closed off body language, or they might look shy, like you know, like it just doesn't look good at all. But something else that's like super common with more beginner guys, but honestly like even more like intermediate, even like a lot of like advanced guys will make a lot of mistakes with this point, and that's like breaking tension. And basically what it comes down to is that they're not really comfortable with the social pressure. And that's going to cause them to break tension. It's just going to cause them to look really, really weak in the social situation. But honestly, like the only real way to get over that is like by exposure, by exposing yourself to social pressure on a regular basis. Like for example, if you stop going out for a while, you know, like you're gonna get worse with this as well. Like you're gonna become more sensitive to social pressure, and that's going to have an extremely negative impact on your subcoms. So that's also like super important. Like if you're new to this, you need to like really like expand your comfort zone when it comes to social pressure. Something else, obviously, that's going to be super characteristic of a beginner is that there's like honestly little to no understanding of female psychology. And this is not only like for like a beginner in game, this is like for the entire like fucking population of men out there. Like a lot of guys are absolutely fucking clueless when it comes to like female psychology. This is like, you can't fucking blame them. Like where are you supposed to learn this? Like no one's telling you this shit. And something else is like really characteristic for like a beginner is that they struggle to sexualize their interactions. And you know, I've broken this down into 3 different categories. So the first category is going to be like inner blocks. Is that like they have a lot of sexual shame, or they have like limiting beliefs around sexualizing or showing intent. They think it's rude, it's impolite, you know, things like that. It's social conditioning basically. So that's something that's like super important to get over as well. And it can also be like they're not willing to take risks. Like, you know, like they're getting like good responses, they're getting validation. They don't want to take a risk in interaction because they might lose that validation, right? So they're basically like, if you had heard of like the expression like playing not to lose and not to win or something like that, this is like the perfect description of what I'm trying to say. But there are also like outer blocks. Like there's like a lack of technical skill in how to like sexualize the interaction. So for example, they don't know how to set the proper frames beforehand that's going to increase the probability of like the interaction becoming successfully sexualized, and they don't know how to build up the compliance all the way up there. And honestly, like it can also sometimes just be like a lack of knowledge, because like most companies out there, like most coaches, they're not gonna teach you how to do this. And like I'm gonna be honest, like a lot of times they're not teaching it because they don't know how to do it themselves, you know. So one of the reasons that a beginner, even like advanced guys, might not be doing this is because they simply don't know that they're supposed to. Something else that's like really like typical for beginners, that they don't know how to handle concerns or like how to like overcome certain objections. So basically if they get like even like a weak objection, like it could be like a super weak objection, like, yeah, you know, I'm waking up early tomorrow, like when you're trying to pull, and it's gonna be like, oh, okay, you know, like they don't even try to like overcome it, and they don't know what to say to overcome that. And if you don't know, it's cool. I'm gonna drop videos about that later as well. There's a lot of good shit coming for you guys. And also something else, the last point here that I wanna make about the beginner is that they have basically like zero knowledge or awareness around female archetypes. So they can't differentiate between different personalities and how they should be gamed differently. This could also be said for a lot of intermediates and a lot of advanced guys as well. So some of the biggest bottlenecks that are gonna yield you the highest ROI if you address them. I touched on this a little bit earlier. One of those things is gonna be like, you need to get a structure. You need to have like a super clear structure for how you're gonna move your interactions forward. Another really big sticking point is that there's going to be just a general lack of value / attraction. And you're also gonna have weak subcoms. So basically structure, value, attraction, and subcoms. So what's the solution here? Luckily, we have a free course that covers all of this. It's gonna give you a structure, open and close, the UMP method. But when it comes to attraction and value, I'm going to drop a video in the future on how to DHV, and it's gonna be a massive fucking video. But it is something that we address in the mini course as well. Marcus does a really good job of explaining it there, so I recommend you check that out as well. Apart from the structure and value attraction, you need to focus on like developing like a strong subcoms. So basically like becoming comfortable with social pressure, like getting good body language, getting good eye contact, all of those things. You know, you fix those things, you're gonna see your results fucking absolutely skyrocket. All right, so we talked about Noob. Let's move ahead to what an intermediate stage typically looks like. So when you're an intermediate, you're a bit more calculated than a noob. If I asked like an intermediate why they did X, they would be able to give me a decent reasoning 50% of the time. And like a lot of times, that's gonna be okay. If you can, you know, justify 50% of what you're doing, fuck it, that's better than 95%, right? But this is like something that you really want to focus on like improving. The closer you can get to like 100%, everything you're doing being like calculated, the better. But there's still like a lot of fluff, and there's still like a lot of room for optimization. With your verbals, with everything, like your structure, your decision making, everything can be optimized and made so much better, but still a lot better than a beginner. You have a structure that you are trying to follow most of the time. Like keyword here is you're trying to follow it most of the time. But a lot of the time you also end up freestyling and doing random shit as well. So it's basically one of the most important things for like an intermediate is becoming even more in tune with your strategy, with your plan, with your structure. And it's something that's like super common when you look at an intermediate game is like there is a lot of random shit going on that basically causes them to like lose control of the interaction. And the more you can like narrow down that randomness, the more control they're going to have, and the easier it's going to be for them to lead the interaction from open to close in a more efficient way and in a more consistent way. I feel like that's like the most important thing. They're gonna be a lot more consistent. Something that's like super characteristic for an intermediate is like inconsistency in results, and this is like one of the big reasons why. Something else that's related to this is like sometimes they follow their structure a bit too rigidly, you know? They're not calibrating to the situation in front of them. But this is like somewhat of like a learning curve, like when you get used to like using a structure, this is like normal, this is like expected to happen. But there are certain times where you do need to go off structure, but this should not, you know, happen often at all. It should only happen if there's like a concern or something that you need to handle. Unless like something that you need to like reframe, or that has to be like addressed like right now. Otherwise, I would never like really recommend to go off structure. Alright, so the second thing that's like super characteristic for an intermediate, I kind of like already touched on this, it's like results occur, but they are sort of like random and inconsistent. You have little control over your interactions, but sometimes you get lucky basically. Like sometimes, you know, you're just a type or something like that, you just get lucky. They're already like chasing, you know, things like that. And like most of your dates, you don't end up closing. You know, for whatever reason, maybe there was like a concern you couldn't overcome, maybe you said something like really bad and like your value plummeted. You ended up in like a bad frame, you ended up reinforcing bad frames set by the other person. You know, it could be a lot of things, but like the key thing here is that you're not really like closing the deal. But what's positive when someone becomes an intermediate is that they start to really like develop like a grasp and understanding around the fundamentals, like basic like DHVing, getting qualified, sexualizing and closing. But something that I've noticed like coaching intermediate guys is that they're able to like DHV and they display value, as long as everything is going according to plan. But if they're being like thrown off their game, they're like being thrown off track, or like the conversation is getting like a bit derailed, they struggle to find and create those openings and opportunities to display more value. Something else like characteristic for an intermediate is that they're able to get them to qualify and get them to chase a little bit if everything is going according to plan. But if they get thrown off their game, they get thrown off their structure, they're standing there clueless and they don't know how to get them to qualify again or how to get them to chase. The thing is that they might not be super subtle when they're trying to get them to qualify, when they're trying to get them in like the chasing frame, they're not being subtle about it and they get pushback. And that's something that can be like easily fixed by using like, for example, like anti-frames instead of being like very blunt and direct about it. So like a good example of like an anti-frame could be like, yeah, look, like I don't usually like date inexperienced girls. And that's going to cause her to say like, I'm not inexperienced. Boom. Now you gotta qualify. Like it's really that simple. And you can obviously do that by like imposing like any negative frame really. So something else is that you have a general awareness around social dynamics. What I mean by that is like with conscious effort, you're able to read a group dynamic, but you might not be able to form a strategy based on what you read. Or you might not be able to like make accurate deductions based on your observations. For example, you might be able to see like, okay, person A and person B, they're like clearly together, but you can't read further into this dynamic. So for example, like you don't know who's the one chasing, you don't know what the power dynamic is like. And like I said earlier, you won't be able to like on the spot come up with like a strategy on like how to create like a more favorable group dynamic for yourself when you're like entering that. Something else that's like really good when you go from like a beginner to intermediate is that you're starting to develop like a general awareness around frames and like how to interpret them. With conscious effort, you're able to like interpret frames and subtext. Like you're basically getting a lot better at reading between the lines. And something that applies for like higher intermediates is that when you become higher intermediate, with conscious effort, you're gonna be able to flip some of these frames that are like negative for you. But you might not always do it in the most subtle way. Super characteristic, and this will often like cause the other person to like push back a little bit and like challenge your attempt of flipping the frame. Maybe you were like too blunt about it and you triggered her ego, or it was simply too obvious and just came across like try hard. Something else for intermediate is that you sometimes set negative frames for yourself, but you're able to catch yourself afterwards. You realize that you fucked up, and sometimes you might be able to turn that around. And that's something that applies more for like higher intermediates. They're able to like catch themselves like, oh shit, I set a really horrible frame. Now I need to go back, do some damage control, and then I can keep moving forward. Something else is that they sometimes manage to get them chasing, but when they do, it's mostly by luck. And they're not able to always create this dynamic proactively. Like they don't know the actual steps of how to create this dynamic. They don't really truly understand how this dynamic works and why it's like this. But sometimes they're able to have it happen by just like sheer accident or luck. Something else that's really good when someone goes from a beginner to intermediate is that they're starting to get a lot better sense on how to interpret compliance levels. It's starting to become more intuitive. They're gonna be a lot better at differentiating between, for example, positive compliance, neutral compliance, and negative compliance. And you also have like a general understanding of how to deal with each of these different responses. And you know, like if you don't know how to deal with these different responses, then how the fuck are you gonna be able to consistently move things forward? Let's just take luck completely out of the picture. If you don't know how to respond to each of these three different responses, like you can only get these three different responses, then how the fuck are you going to consistently be able to move from A to B to C to D? So they know that, for example, when you get positive compliance, you basically like reward with validation, and then you can ask for even more compliance afterwards. You're building that compliance momentum basically. And they also know that when you get neutral compliance, they might need to reframe, or they might need to get even more explicit agreement, like more verbal compliance before they're able to move forward. And they know that when they get negative compliance, they need to either reframe or ask for less compliance. And they also need to like start thinking like, okay, like what is the reason? Why am I getting this negative response? Is it because lack of value? Is it because there's like a concern? Like why is it? And they're able to think about that like a little bit more on the spot, and they might sometimes be able to sort of like turn that negative compliance into positive compliance. Something else is that they're starting to get a more like intuitive feel of like, okay, what are like the current compliance levels and what exactly am I able to like get away with right now? Like how much am I able to ask for? Something else is like a really big improvement from being like a beginner to like more intermediate is that you're able to sometimes sexualize the interaction, but it's not very consistent. So for example, you might end up like getting like challenged when you try to do this and you don't really know how to respond or how to react. Or you're just simply doing it in like an uncalibrated way. It's like pretty common for like intermediate, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything creepy or anything. It could more be like you didn't pick the right angle because you didn't read the personality that well. So something that would have worked really well with like another person didn't work as well with this one. Something else is that they might not try to get verbal compliance before they do, and they just do it a little bit too early and it just comes across a little bit abrupt. It's not very smooth. But it could also be like they're simply like asking for too much too early, like they didn't baby step and build up that compliance momentum. Something else with intermediate is that in general, their subcoms, they're actually okay, but there's still like a lot of room for improvement, obviously. It's like they know how to like come across as assertive like most of the time. You know, like you're looking at them from the outside, you're like, yeah, this guy looks confident. You can see they're looking like confident, they're looking assertive, they're looking relaxed. That's good. And a lot of times they're actually like doing pretty well with not breaking tension. Or at least they're not the ones who are breaking it first. And I feel like that's like one of the most important things. You don't want to be the one breaking it first. It just comes across as like really weak. And like sometimes they know how to handle concerns, but they might not always be able to identify the like real core concern. And they often end up like wasting a lot of time trying to handle like smokescreen concerns or whatever when there's like something deeper that needs to be addressed. For example, you could get like the response when you're trying to pull, it could be like, oh, I need to stay with my friends. When in reality, the real concern could really be like that she doesn't think that she deserves you. Like you're being perceived as too high value to the point where she just gets insecure. And what is the correct solution there? The correct solution there is obviously not to deal with the friends. The correct solution is to handle that, like the core concern. And the way you would do that is like by like qualifying. Then it could also be like, you could get that like, I need to stay with my friends when the reality is that there's just not much incentive to go with you. There's not much that much value. And then the solution is obviously not either to deal with the friend thing. The solution is to build and display more value. So something else that's like really good for intermediates is that they're starting to like actually like develop an understanding for the female psychology. So they're starting to like get like a really good grasp and understanding of what it is that actually like generates attraction. But they do have a very limited understanding around the different archetypes. But for higher intermediates, there's actually starting to learn about them and like how to handle them differently. For example, you're able to separate between, let's just take two different like very broad generalizations. There are some that respond much better to like validation and reassurance, and there are some that respond much better to being like playfully pushed away. If you address the one that needs more reassurance and validation, the same way that you would do with like the second group, like the one who likes to be playfully pushed away, that's just not going to end up really well. And the reverse applies here as well. If you're like trying to reassure and validate the one who thinks it's more fun to be like playfully pushed away or like responds better to that, it's just super uncalibrated, you know? You can't game everyone the same way, it just doesn't work that way. Something else with even the higher intermediates is that a lot of times they're going to be wrong in their initial assessments of what they think the blueprint is. So a lot of times they're going to have to realize, oh shit, you know, like I was wrong, I thought it was this type, but it turns out that it's actually this type. And then they might be able to switch their approach if they caught it in time. They might even like realize this like far in like retrospect, you know, when they're back home, like, oh shit, I went with like the completely wrong angle, I took the completely wrong approach. But you know, you learn from that, you learn a lot from that. So what I would say are like the biggest bottlenecks for like someone who's more intermediate is that, you know, they're not able to like always like consistently sexualize in like the most calibrated way, and they're not always able to create the most favorable dynamics. Like they're not being very proactive in like getting them to chase. You know, I also mentioned earlier, like obviously like the structure, like maybe like 50% of what they're saying has like some solid reasoning behind it. So for an intermediate, the best thing that you can do is like try to bring that 50% of what you're doing is calculated and calibrated. If you bring that up to like 80%, you know, that's gonna increase in like a massive fucking difference in like how many you're like able to convert, like all the way from open to close. I would say those three things. If you're an intermediate, you should focus on becoming more consistent in the way that you sexualize, and that you do it in a way that's like calculated to the archetype, you know, that you're able to like gather the information throughout the interaction, and you use that later to find like the specific angles that's going to stick with this specific one, right? And also becoming a lot more proactive in setting up this like positive dynamics. So for example, like when it comes to like the groups, is that being able to read what's actually going on already, so that you know what has to be changed in order to like achieve that desired dynamic. But also like when it comes to like one-on-one, being a lot more conscious about, you know, who's in the chasing frame, and like how do you reverse that chasing frame. And basically the way you do it is just like getting them to qualify and displaying value. It's really that simple. There's just not much focus on it. And obviously like when you get a lot better at that's gonna like shoot your like conversion rates through the fucking roof. All right, so that's it for this one. And in the next one, I'm going to cover advanced, and that's going to be like a really big one. So basically what I want to do is I want to give you guys like insight as to what the like more advanced thought process looks like, what the decision-making process looks like. It's going to be a different video, it's going to be a massive one. But yeah, so what you should do now is that you should get the free course that Marcus did. I'll drop a link to it below. You know, like if you start applying just what's in that free course, like you're gonna fucking skyrocket. There is just no question about it. All right, guys, you know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe. Peace out.